cold, hard, undeniable reality of the gun was the only thing that mattered in the universe. It was a small, black semi-automatic, but in the shaking hand of a woman who had completely lost her grip on reality, it looked like a cannon. It was pressed firmly against the temple of my 16-year-old daughter. Lily, her breath hitched, a tiny, terrified sound that was drowned out by the roaring in my ears. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of disbelief and pure primal fear, were locked. On mine, "Pay the fees, you delinquent little brat." The woman shrieked, her voice a raw, venomous hiss that cut through the quiet afternoon air. "You think you can live here for free? You think you're better than us? This is my community. I make the rules here. You will follow the rules, or you will face the consequences." The woman was Margaret, the self-appointed president of our new, self-created Homeowners Association. A bully, a tyrant, a woman who had been waging a campaign of terror against my family for months. Lily had just been walking home from school, taking a shortcut across a small, dusty patch of common land that bordered our property. Margaret had confronted her, demanding a made-up community improvement fee that we had repeatedly refused to pay. And when my brave, stubborn daughter had politely but firmly refused, Margaret had snapped. She had pulled a gun. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. My vision narrowed until all I could see was the muzzle of that gun against my daughter's skin. Lily's petrified face and the insane, hate-filled eyes of the woman holding it. A sound tore from my throat, a guttural, animalistic roar of a mother seeing her child in mortal danger. I lunged forward, not thinking, only feeling. And that's when everything went wrong. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment. What would you do if this happened to you? And subscribe to HOA Files. To understand that moment of sheer heart-stopping terror, you have to understand the history of our block and the woman who tried to conquer it. My name is Grace. I'm a freelance graphic designer. I work from home, a quiet life of creativity and deadlines that I cherish. My home isn't just a house, it's my heritage. It's the only home I've ever known. It was built by my great-grandfather. In the 1920s, a sturdy, charming brick, arts and crafts style home on a large double lot at the end of a quiet, tree-lined street. He was a man who believed in community and putting down deep roots. For generations, our block was just that, a block. A collection of a dozen or so older, unique homes. A place where neighbors knew each other, where kids played kick the can in the street until the fireflies came out. Community was an unspoken reality, a fabric woven from shared cups of sugar and decades of watching each other's kids grow up. It wasn't something that needed to be legislated in a 3-inch thick binder. But our city, like so many others, has been changing. It's been discovered. New money has been moving in, tearing down the smaller, older homes and replacing them with massive, modern structures that loom over the traditional architecture, casting long shadows of glass and steel. And with this new money came a new, aggressive attitude. An attitude that was perfectly embodied by Margaret. Margaret and her husband moved in 2 years ago. They tore down the quaint little bungalow across the street and erected a giant gray, modernist box of a house that looked more like a regional bank headquarters than a home. From the moment she arrived, she seemed to view her quiet, unpretentious block not as a community to join, but as a hostile corporation to be taken over. She saw our lack of formal rules not as a sign of neighborly trust, but as a sign of decay and chaos that she, and only she, was qualified to fix. Within 6 months, she had browbeaten and cajoled a handful of the other new, wealthy residents into forming the historic Elm Street Block Homeowners Association. It was a complete and utter sham, an HOA created out of thin air for a neighborhood that had never had or needed one. The vote was contentious. Most of the older, longtime residents like me were vehemently against it. But the newer residents with their higher property values were given more weight in the vote, a legal quirk she had exploited. She, of course, had herself elected president. Her first official act was to come to my door. She wasn't alone. She had a small entourage, 2 other women from the board, all of them holding thick, professionally printed binders. "Grace," she'd announced, her tone leaving no room for discussion. I am so thrilled to inform you that we have finally formalized and incorporated our community with an official homeowners association. It's a new era for Elm Street. We are going to be making so many wonderful improvements: coordinated landscaping, new decorative street lighting, private security patrols. It's going to increase all of our property values enormously. She held out the binder. Here is the welcome packet with the new official bylaws and the fee schedule. Your initial buy-in assessment is $500 and the mandatory monthly dues are $200. I was stunned. I felt like a citizen of a country that had just been peacefully but decisively invaded. Margaret, I'd replied, my voice shaking slightly. I appreciate the effort, but this house has been here for 100 years. We've never been part of an HOA, and I have no intention of joining one now. I voted against this. Not interested, thank you. Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold, hard disbelief. I don't think you understand, she said, her voice dropping, taking on a menacing, condescending tone. This isn't optional anymore. We have a legal majority of the block's homeowners. We're the legal governing body now. The vote was ratified. You don't get to just opt out because you're feeling sentimental. You benefit from our improvements, so you must pay. I'm sorry, but I disagree, I said, my hand tightening on the doorknob. I will not be paying. I closed the door on her sputtering, indignant face. That was the day the war began. The first shot was a formal invoice, left in my mailbox, for mandatory community association dues. It had a past due stamp on it in angry red ink. I simply wrote, "Return to sender, not a member" on the envelope, and put it back in the mail. My heart pounding with a mixture of fear and defiance. A few days later, Margaret was at my door again, this time alone. Her face was flushed with anger. I received your returned invoice. This is not a game, Grace. You cannot just refuse to pay. We are improving your neighborhood. You are legally obligated to pay your share. We have a signed petition. We have a charter. You have a piece of paper, Margaret, I said, my own voice firmer this time. You can't just invent an HOA and force a homeowner who has been here for a century to join it against their will. We will see what our very expensive lawyers have to say about that, she shrieked, and stormed off, leaving me trembling but resolute. The harassment started in earnest after that. Her HOA, which was really just a vehicle for her own personal vendettas, began a series of community improvement projects, and I was billed for every single one of them. They hired a high-priced landscaping firm to plant new HOA approved Bradford pear trees in the common grass verges along the sidewalks. It was a nice enough project, I suppose, if you ignored the fact that Bradford pears are a notoriously weak and invasive species. But it was followed by a massive special assessment bill in my mailbox for $5,000, my supposed share of the cost. I refused to pay. A few days later, I woke up to find that all the yard waste from their tree planting project, all the discarded branches, the empty bags of mulch, the uprooted chunks of old sod, had been deliberately and neatly piled up on my front lawn, forming a huge, ugly mound right under my living room window. My inner monologue was a screaming match between my non-confrontational nature and my growing, righteous fury. This woman was a bully, plain and simple. She was a tyrant who was using her neighbor's money to harass me, and she was escalating. I felt targeted, harassed, and increasingly unsafe in my own home. My daughter, Lily, was scared. Installed a security camera on my front porch that very day, a sad modern necessity in the home my great-grandfather had built in an era of unlocked doors. And then, the threats became real. I received a terrifyingly official-looking letter sent via certified mail from a large, intimidating law firm downtown. It was a formal notice of the HOA's intent to place a lien on my home for the now thousands of dollars in unpaid, completely fraudulent fees, fines, and special assessments. The fear that hit me was a cold, physical thing. Lien. That was a word with real power. That was a word that could threaten my ownership of my home, my daughter's inheritance, my family's entire history in this place. The legal pressure was immense. I felt like I was being backed into a corner, that I was about to lose everything. To this woman's insane, obsessive crusade, I started having trouble sleeping. I felt a constant low-grade anxiety, the feeling of being under siege. My work suffered. I felt trapped, isolated. I knew I needed a lawyer, but a legal battle with an HOA funded by the deep pockets of my wealthy new neighbors was a fight I couldn't afford. Desperate, I started thinking about my great-grandfather. He had been a successful man, a meticulous man. I remembered my mother telling me stories about the old iron lockbox in the attic, the one where he kept all of his most important papers. I had never opened it. It was a relic from the past, sealed by a heavy, ornate lock, whose key had been lost to time. It was full of documents I assumed were long since irrelevant, told deeds, business records, things from another century. But now, in my desperation, I wondered if there was anything in there, any old document, any piece of forgotten history that could help me. And that brings us to that terrible afternoon. While I was in the attic, staring at that old, rusty lockbox, contemplating taking a crowbar to it, my daughter Lily was walking home from school. And Margaret, in her final catastrophic and unforgivable escalation, was waiting for her. The confrontation. It's the argument over the made-up fees for the new community garden she was planning. The moment she pulled the gun, it was all a blur of terror. I heard the screams and ran outside, my mind a blank slate of pure parental fear, and I tackled her. Wrestling the gun away as the neighborhood erupted into chaos, the police arrived quickly. The scene was a mess of shouting neighbors, a crying, traumatized teenager, and a screaming, hysterical woman who was now unbelievably accusing me of assaulting her. They arrested Margaret, of course. The sight of a gun pointed at a child was something they couldn't ignore, no matter how much she claimed she was the victim, that she was just protecting community assets. The immediate threat was over. But as I held my sobbing daughter, I knew the war was not. The lien was still hanging over my head. The HOA and the wealthy, powerful residents who enabled Margaret's tyranny were still there. I knew they would use this incident, twist it, and come after me with everything they had. They would paint me as the aggressor, my daughter as a delinquent, would bury me in legal fees until I had nothing left. That night, after Lily was safely asleep, her door slightly ajar so I could hear her if she had a nightmare, I went back up to the attic. With a crowbar, a hammer, and a heart full of cold, determined rage, I finally pried open my great-grandfather's iron lockbox. Inside, beneath layers of brittle, yellowed documents, was a thick, heavy, leather-bound portfolio. It felt important. I took it downstairs to the dining room table, and under the warm glow of the lamp, I carefully opened it. It was a collection of the original legal documents for the entire Elm Street block. And as I began to read, as my designer's eye for detail began to piece together the century-old legal language and the intricate, hand-drawn maps, the world began to shift on its axis. My great-grandfather had been the original developer of the entire Elm Street block. He'd subdivided the land and sold the houses, yes? But he hadn't sold the land itself. He had created in a strange, archaic legal maneuver that was common in the 1920s, but is almost unheard of today, a series of 99-year land leases. The people who bought the houses, the original owners and all of their successors, owned the physical structures, the buildings, the bricks and mortar. But the land underneath them, every single square inch of it, the lawns, the driveways, the common verges, the very ground Margaret's own ugly modernist box was built on, still belonged to him, to his estate, to his heir, to me, and the leases, all of them, the ones for every single house on the block, were set to expire in 3 months. The discovery was a bombshell that changed everything. The lien was a joke. The HOA itself was a joke. They were a tenants association, a glorified book club, squabbling over rules for a property they didn't even own. And their tyrannical president had just been arrested for pulling a gun on the daughter of their new and very, very unamused landlord. The next morning, my lawyer, a man who had been deeply worried about our chances and had been advising me to settle, was practically giddy, could barely contain his excitement. He drafted a letter, a beautiful, glorious, world-destroying letter. We sent it via certified mail to every single homeowner on the historic Elm Street block, including Margaret, who was now out on bail and back in her house, presumably plotting her next move. A woman who had no idea that an even bigger, more legally binding eviction notice than the ones she was so fond of was about to land on her doorstep. The letter was calm, professional, and absolutely devastating. It began by informing the residents of the true ownership status of the land their homes were built upon. It included a certified copy of the master plat and the original 1924 master lease agreement from my great-grandfather's portfolio. It then politely informed them that their 99-year land leases were all due to expire in 90 days, and then came the final, beautiful, crushing blow. The letter stated that I, as the sole heir and the new landowner, would be happy to offer new, fair market rate land lease agreements to all residents of the block in good standing, allowing them to continue to live in their homes. However, it continued due to the recent unfortunate events, including a sustained campaign of illegal harassment, the filing of a fraudulent lien against a non-member, and a violent, felonious assault with a deadly weapon. The offer of a new lease would not be extended to the residents of Margaret's address. The letter was, in fact, her official, legally binding 90-day notice to vacate the property. She was being evicted, not from her house, but from the land underneath it. She was free to sell her house, of course, to anyone who was willing to then pay the $250,000 fee to have the entire massive structure physically lifted off its foundation and moved off of my land. The entire neighborhood was thrown into a state of shock, followed by a state of pure, unadulterated fury, all of it directed at Margaret. The HOA, the source of her power, was dissolved in a single, panicked emergency meeting that very night. Her cronies on the board deserted her instantly. She was a pariah, the woman whose arrogance and cruelty had put all of their homes there. Life's biggest investment, at the mercy of the very woman she had tried to destroy. Margaret was completely and utterly defeated. She was facing serious criminal charges. She was facing a civil lawsuit from me for damages and emotional distress. And now she was being legally and irrevocably evicted from the land her life was built on. Her perfect, modern, gray box of a house was now just a massive, worthless liability on land that was no longer hers. I met with my neighbors, the ones who had been her silent, intimidated followers. They were humbled. They were terrified. And they were, for the first time, genuinely neighborly. I wasn't a tyrant. I offered them all new, very fair, and very reasonable land lease agreements. I didn't want their money. I just wanted my peace. I just wanted my daughter to feel safe. The neighborhood, finally free from Margaret's poisonous reign, began to feel like a real community for the first time in years. This whole nightmare taught me a lesson that was buried in the very history I cherish. Power and ownership are complex things. People who build their authority on flimsy, man-made rules and intimidation often forget to check the foundations. Margaret was so obsessed with being the queen of her little castle that she'd never, ever bothered to read the deed and find out who owned the kingdom. She thought she could take my home. But she ended up losing her own. Margaret's house was eventually sold for pennies on the dollar to a specialized home moving company and hauled away on a series of massive flatbed trucks, leaving behind nothing but an empty lot, a scar on the land. But her cousin, a notoriously aggressive real estate lawyer from the city, has just purchased the house next door and is now challenging the original 1920s master lease agreement in court, claiming it's an antiquated and legally unenforceable contract under modern property law.